Hello. So yes, as mentioned, I've been doing this for quite a long time. I've been working on the web since about 1996, which makes me old enough to remember when the arguments we were having were whether we should use CSS at all, or whether we should stick to font tags for styling our text. And I was using CSS for layout back when Netscape 4 was a thing. I like to ask this question: who else has developed for Netscape 4? Oh, there's quite a few here. You are my people. This is great. This is a good start. I was a Web Standards project member and part of the Dreamweaver task force, and essentially we were brought into the Web Standards project to try and encourage standards in that authoring tool, which is really where a lot of my interest in things like layout comes from. You know, how can we visually represent layout? How can we do layout in a good way? And since I started working with CSS has become absolutely amazing. These examples are CSS-only demos. We can do all this animation. You've just heard about animation that we can do. We can do things that we used to use JavaScript for, we used to use Flash for, we can do right there in CSS. We've come a long way. But there's one part of CSS that seemed to get kind of stuck in 2006, and that was layout. The techniques that we're using for layout seem really hard and really fragile, and the reason is they were never designed for laying out complex web applications. They were certainly never designed for doing responsive design. But there's hope. And hope comes in this group of modules, and hopefully you were inspired a bit by the work that Jen's been doing yesterday. We've got Flexbox, we've got CSS Grid Layout, and we've got Box Alignment. And they're kind of coming together to create a new system for doing layout on the web, a tailor-made system for the kind of things that we need to do. And I've got a whole bunch of code examples in my slides. I'm going to fly through this very quickly, so please later, when you get back to your offices, when you get home, have a look at that code. I'll talk a bit about the browser support towards the end. So I'm going to start by explaining a few things about grid layout and how it works, and then move on to some worked examples. First, we define a grid. And we do that with a new value of the display property. We've got display grid, and you can also use inline grid. So that's a bit like Flexbox. If you say display flex, all the child items, they become flex items. You say display grid, all the child elements become grid items. We create tracks on that grid, and we use grid template columns and grid template rows. So here I'm creating a 3-column and 3-row grid. We're defining an explicit grid here. And our items, our child elements, they all just fall into a cell of the grid. If I want to space those out, I use grid gap. And that's a shorthand for grid column gap and grid row gap. So that gives us gutters between our grid items. Now I'm creating a fixed width grid here. I'm using pixels. But grid layout has been created for a responsive web. It allows for the creation of flexible grids really easily. And to do that, we've got this new unit, the FR unit. That's a fraction unit. It represents a fraction of the available space in the grid container. So if we've got 3 1-fraction unit tracks, then we've got 3 equal width flexible tracks. If we want to change those proportions, then we can assign different fractions to different tracks. So here I've got 1 fraction unit, 1 fraction unit, 2 fraction units. So the available space in the grid container is split into 4. 1 part to each is given to my first 2 tracks and 2 parts to the second. The browser window grows and shrinks. Those tracks scale in proportion. The nice thing about fraction units is that they assign a portion of the available space. So you can mix them with absolute tracks, so tracks that are set with pixels, for instance. My first track here is 500 pixels, and then I've got a 1 fraction unit track and a 2 fraction unit track. So we take away the amount that we need for our 500 pixels and also any gutters, and then the rest of the space we share between our 2 flexible tracks. If you've got a repeating pattern of tracks, perhaps you've got a very complex grid, you've got lots of different tracks, you can use this repeat keywords, this repeat notation. So here I'm saying repeat 3 times 1 fraction unit, and we get our 3-column track grid. We don't have to write out 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. And as it happens, we don't need to declare those row tracks at all. Grid will create tracks for things that are placed outside of the grid you declare. So you create an explicit grid with grid template columns or grid template rows. And then if you place things outside of that, so if you just add more content to your rows, Grid will just create rows for you. And they'll be auto-sized by default, so they'll expand to fit whatever content goes into them. If you happen to want to fix the size of them, so here I'm saying Grid Auto Rows 200 pixels, every new row track that's created will be 200 pixels tall. Now I showed you that repeat syntax, specifying a fixed number of repeating tracks. But you can also ask Grid to create as many columns as will fit into the container. So here I'm saying create as many 200 pixel columns as will fit into the container, using this autofill keyword rather than a value for repeat. And they were kind of fixed width tracks, which meant that we got this gap at the end where it didn't exactly fit. But if we use min-max along with repeat, we can say create tracks that are a minimum of 200 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction unit. The result of that is when we get that gap left over where we can't fit in all the 200 pixel tracks, that amount is just shared out equally because it's 1 fraction unit, shared out between them. So we get this lovely behavior of a fluid number of tracks depending on the amount of space we've got, but we're able to specify that they should be a minimum size and then share the rest of the space. So everything I've shown you so far has been about creating grids. We've got a grid and then the child elements just kind of sit on that grid. But when we think about grids, we're often thinking about, well, I'd like to be able to create a grid and then I'd like to be able to place my items on that grid. I want to be able to use this as a grid framework. And so we have that in Grid. And it's worth knowing a bit more terminology once we start to target areas on the grid. So I mentioned grid tracks already. That's the space between 2 grid lines, so you can have horizontal or vertical tracks. And you define grid tracks when you set up your grid. And once you've got tracks, you've obviously got lines. You've got a line before and after each track. So if you've got a 3-track grid, you've actually got 4 lines when you account for the one on the end. And those lines are indexed according to writing mode. So in a right-to-left language of Arabic, the first column line would be on the right rather than on the left. And then we have grid cells. We've already seen Grid laying items out into cells, and that's the smallest unit on the grid. It's conceptually a bit like a table cell. If we join cells together, we get a grid area. So that's any area of the grid that's bound by 4 grid lines. It needs to be a square or a rectangular area, but bound by 4 grid lines, that's a grid area in which you might place some content. So here I'm using that repeat syntax. I'm creating this 3-column track grid. I can then position my cards on the grid. So I'm dealing with that first item, and I'm starting at line 2 and ending at column line 4, starting at row line 1 and ending at row line 3. And so that places that item and stretches it over a larger grid area. That's fairly verbose as a syntax, so we've got a shorthand here. So here it's exactly the same, except that we're saying grid column, and the start is the value before the forward slash, and the end value comes after the forward slash. You can actually go to an even shorter shorthand and express the whole thing as one line of CSS. And the order of those values is grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, grid column end, which is the other way round to how we specify margins and padding. We've seen line numbers, but it's possible to name those lines, which obviously can be quite useful if you're working with other people, having to keep track of where things are on the grid, especially in a responsive design. That might get quite confusing. You can name lines, and you name them in square brackets before the track that you want you define. So we're defining a track of 1 fraction unit, and we're naming the line before that. So I've named my lines, and then we can just switch out the line numbers for the names that we've defined. You can name those lines anything you like, but if you name them dash start and dash end, you get some magic. You get a grid area created with the main name that you specified. So if you've got main start and main end, you're going to get a grid area called main, which you can actually position things into. We'll have a look at that properly in a minute. Because you can create those named areas explicitly. We can say, I'm going to call the first card main, and the second card side 1, and the third card side 2, for example. And then we just lay them out like this, as the value of the grid template areas property, laying them out in this ASCII art manner. There's a lot of magic. There's a lot of new stuff. So I'm going to show you now some worked examples of using these things, so you can see how you'd actually apply them to kind of real-life layouts. And I'm going to start with this line-based placement, positioning things using lines. So here's a layout, a very simple layout, and we could put that together using really any method that we normally use today. We're going to use grid layout. So there's my HTML. I've got a div with a class of wrapper, and we've got 3 child elements. We've got this header, and we've got 2 divs. Now, without any layout applied, it just lays out like this. It lays out in source order, as you'd expect. So now I create 2 columns, one of 2 fraction units and one of 4, and I'm setting up a gap for both columns and rows. So I've declared a grid, but I haven't positioned my items, and so we end up with this. And what's happening here is the grid is taking each of those child elements and it's popping it into one of the cells that's been created by our 2-column track grid. So nothing's been overlapping, but it's not the layout that we want. So now we need to position the items. So the header with the class of main header spans across the grid from column line 1 to 3, and it sits in grid row 1. The panel comes after column line 1 in grid row 2, and the content sits alongside it, column line 2, grid row 2, which gives us this. So that's it. That's all you need to do to create your layout. If we overlay the grid, you can see the lines, and you can see how the gaps kind of act as a fat line in the grid, so the content comes after that line. And this is where you'll find that full layout. You can have a play around with it later. So if I want to put a footer on my layout, I add that to the markup. And I position it from grid column line 1 to 3 and in grid row 3. And there it is. And it sits underneath. It doesn't matter which of those columns above are longer. That's always going to sit underneath because it's in its own track on the grid. It can't pop up. It doesn't need clearing. Other things to note is that the background on the panel extends all the way down to the bottom. It stretches just like flex items will by default. So you don't need to worry about how short your content is. It's not going to hop up and sit behind there. And we weren't adding any rows to this grid. As I mentioned earlier, grid has this idea of the implicit grid. It creates row tracks to hold content, even if we haven't created those tracks. And so we didn't need to create any row tracks for our content. Those rows are auto-sized. Whatever content we put in, they'll just grow. So we don't really need to worry about specifying rows in this kind of layout. I think an awful lot of regular page layouts, you'll not worry about specifying rows. So if you're as old as me, if you've been doing this, you're one of those people who put their hands up about Netscape 4, you probably built sites using tables for layout, and I imagine some of you are thinking, this is a bit like using tables for layout. And actually conceptually, and certainly when I first came to grid layout, that's very much how I thought about it. Actually, I already had that model in my head because I built sites with tables. But there are some differences. Grid doesn't rely on your content being in a particular order in the source. If you did develop for tables, you remember how we had to fragment our designs across lots of different table cells, often in a strange order, in order to get the layout that we wanted. You don't have to do that with grid. And because things are entirely described in CSS, our layout is in the CSS, we can easily move things around the grid at different breakpoints. We can introduce a grid or redefine a grid at any breakpoint. So as a quick example of that, if I keep the same layout I got before, but this time I'm going to start mobile first, creating a simple grid as a sort of 1-column grid for mobile devices. I'm actually using grid here just to reorder some of the content visually. So I end up with something like this for narrow widths. And then within my media queries, I just redefine the grid and I go back to my 2-column track grid that I had before. So grid makes it very easy just to move things around based on media queries if you want to do that. So we have these named lines. We've been working with line numbers so far, and especially once you get into more complex responsive layouts, you probably want to start to give some of your lines at least names to make it easier to remember where to position things. So staying with that same layout, when I define my single column for the mobile layout, I'm just naming some of those lines. And the value there, so in this case we've got auto because we want our tracks to be auto, that comes after the line that I'm naming. We're actually naming the line and not the track. That's important to remember. And so then, instead of having these line numbers, we can use the names. And you could take that out then to your wider layout and name some of the lines as you define the track. And if you're careful, you can keep the names exactly the same between different breakpoints. So you know that content always comes after the line named content. So that's lines, and you've always got lines on your grid. It doesn't matter which positioning method you're using, you'll always have lines to use if you want to. But we also have these named areas. So once again, staying with the same markup. The first thing I do, outside of any media queries, is I give the areas on the grid a name. Now that's a name that I choose. It can be anything really. It's just an identifier for the area. So we're using the grid area property for this, which is the same property for the very short one-line shorthand that we used for line-based positioning. And then, when I set up my grid, this is for the mobile layout, I just describe how the layout should look actually in my CSS. So I'm saying I want the header, then I want the content, then I want the sidebar, then I want the footer. And I get my narrow layout like this. And there it is with the areas overlaid. And then within the media queries, and I think you can see the sort of ASCII art taking shape here. We've got the header and the sidebar and the content and the footer. And so we end up with this. And for straightforward layouts, this is a really, really nice way to work. And I've been working with Grid for about 4 years now, and I've been prototyping things, just prototyping stuff that I need to build using this method because it's so easy just to move things around on the grid. So actually using new stuff for prototyping is quite a nice tip because it can never get out there into the web until Grid actually ships, but you can use it as a prototyping technique and you get this kind of side benefit that you learn this new specification. But this technique is fantastic for just playing around with layout. A couple of things you might want to note. If we repeat the name of an area, it causes that to span over the grid cells. So here we're saying that we want the header and the footer to span across both cells. You can have multiple white space characters between those, so you can line up your ASCII art. We've thought of that. And if you want to leave a cell empty, use a full stop period character or multiple full stops again in order to line up the ASCII art. So if we've put a dot there underneath sidebar, then what happens is the footer now just sits underneath the content. It doesn't span all the way across, so it leaves that cell empty. There's kind of some magic in here. We get these implicit named grid lines when we do this. So this is our layout as before, and we've got this named grid area called content. So Grid creates for us content start and content end for rows and columns, which means if I create an area called test, I've got a class of test here, and I've given it a background color so we can see it. And I'm using those named lines, which I've not defined anywhere, but Grid's created for us to position that item. And so we get this. And what this also demonstrates is that you can layer items on the grid. So you can stack things up any way you like. And for that, you use z-index, just like absolute positioning. So you can layer things on your grid. And there's all sorts of interesting possibilities just in that fact. So that's a very simple kind of layout that we've created there, a very simple grid layout. But I think when we're thinking about grids today, we're probably mostly thinking about these kind of 12-column grid frameworks, 16-column grid frameworks, or perhaps an unusual number of columns, but some kind of multiple-column grid that we create, and then we use that to lay out our pages with. So we see that in frameworks such as Bootstrap, which I know other speakers have already had a bash at, so I'll just join in. I'm not a framework hater. I think that they have served a very, very good purpose for us. Layout is hard, it is fragile. I have a business to run. You all work for businesses. You have to do these things, and you have to do things quickly. And these frameworks have helped us do that. You know, I use them sometimes in my own work because I have to get things out of the door. So it's not that these things are utterly terrible. You should never, ever use them. Not at all. However, as you can see in this markup, we've got an awful lot of stuff in here, which is essentially describing our layout. We're describing layout in markup. And conceptually, that's a very heavy thing to do. And even if you abstract that out using SAS, you've still got this kind of one-one relationship between your markup and your content and the display of it. And as you get more and more breakpoints, as you're adding enormous TVs and tiny watches and things, how much of this stuff do you want to sort of jam into your markup? Or even if it is abstracted one level with SAS. It's a kind of difficult way to work, and it starts to fall down if that content is always tied together with the display. So the thing with CSS Grid Layout, we're describing the layout in CSS, which means that we can just add those breakpoints if we need to. If we see that something isn't displaying so well on some new device that's shipped, we can think, well, we could make a little optimization just there in the CSS. We don't need to touch any of our documents to do that. The other thing about replacing layout frameworks with grid is that you really need to shift your mindset to be able to do that, because we're talking about something which is conceptually quite different when we're starting to actually describe layout in CSS rather than have it tied directly to our markup. So let's have a little look at that. I've been playing around with some examples. So the typography in the earlier example came from a framework called Skeleton, which is a kind of lightweight CSS framework, very similar, though, to something like Bootstrap. It's a little bit cleaner, though, so it's a bit simpler to use as a demo. So this is the markup for the Skeleton grid, and that's just an example off their website. So you can see, again, we've got this same idea that you get with Bootstrap. You've got divs that make up rows, and then inside those rows, we create some divs for the different columns. And this is a little example layout. And you end up with something that looks a bit like this. So that's just the default Skeleton grid. So I thought, well, maybe I can try and make this using grid layout and see if that works. So first, I removed all of those row divs, because I don't think we need those when we're using grid layout. And I've also removed any description of how the grid works from the markup. So I've added classes. We haven't got anything semantic to call these areas, so I'm just calling them box 1 to 11. What I've done is I've removed any description of the layout from the markup. And I then create my grid. And you can see I'm using that repeat keyword here, and I'm repeating the pattern 12 times. And I'm naming the one fraction unit track, I'm naming it col. And that means I'm going to have repeated lines named col, which is something we can use to our ends in a bit. I'm also doing the same with rows, calling them row. So I've got multiple column and row lines. And I now place the items on the grid. And I'm using the named line syntax here. So here I'm saying, box 1, I'd like to start on the first line named col. So I say col, and I say span 4. And grid row, row, which will be the first line named row. But if we go down to box 8, I'd like that to start on grid column col 7 and span 3, and grid row, row 3. So being able to use this span keyword is quite useful because it means you can sort of place components and say that I just want this component to always span 3 tracks of my grid. I don't, even if you don't know which line it's going to start on. That's quite a handy thing to be able to do. And if we work through, we end up with this, which is pretty much the same as the skeleton example. So that's quite neat. I can replace a grid framework like that with grid layout. But we can actually go a step further with grid layout because it allows us to do something that these frameworks really can't do. And that's to span rows. We can span rows in exactly the same way that we can span columns. So we can set some of those up to span rows. And we end up with the third example here, where I'm not just putting things into single rows, I'm actually spanning over row tracks. And the heights go to the gutter, no matter how much content is in there. Behavior very similar to that of Flexbox. And you can have a play around with that at this URL. So once we've created a grid framework, or we're using CSS Grid as a grid framework, we then can lay out a design using that framework. So this is a more realistic example. I'm going back to that earlier design, that simple page layout, but this time I'm laying it out on the grid that I've just created. So we're saying the main header, we want to start on col and span 12, and it goes into row. And you can see the content there is spanning 8 columns, and the panel is spanning 4. So there's the layout. We go back to this, and you can have a look at that URL. And it's really easy to play around with this layout. If we decide things want to span different numbers of tracks, if we want to add a little bit of less symmetry to our design or so on, we can just change those lines very easily. Perhaps I don't want the footer to stretch right across the bottom. I'd like the panel to go all the way to the bottom and the footer to sit underneath the content. Well, that's quite simple to do. I can just change where those tracks end. And then we get this. Again, it's all defined there in the CSS. We don't need to change anything about our markup to change how elements lay out on the page. So that's it. That's the entire CSS defining our layout. There's no linked style sheet. There's no framework linked in. There's nothing that I've had to pull in to create my grid. The grid is created by CSS itself, natively. And yeah, as Jen said yesterday, just like Flexbox, we're going to see everyone posting their grid layout-based grid framework on GitHub, and everyone tweeting about it far more than they tweet about the actual specification. If you're thinking about creating one of these abstractions, or in a year's time you're thinking about using one, what value does it add? What value does it add to the actual spec? Or are you just adding some sort of weird convenience, which doesn't really help anything at all, rather than learning how to use the spec? We really don't need a grid layout-based grid framework because it is a grid framework. Please take that away from here and tell your friends. So back at the start of this talk, I showed examples of creating a grid with a set of boxes that kind of position themselves on the grid without us doing anything. And the rules around this auto placement of grid items are defined by the grid item placement algorithm. And if you like to read specifications, you can read exactly what that means. There's a lot of stuff in the spec, as in all specs, that are really for browser engines. How should a browser deal with getting a bunch of stuff thrown at a grid and laying it out? So that's what's in the spec. If you like reading those things, it can be quite interesting. You can learn an awful lot by picking apart that process. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how this works. So in our simple example, you can see that grid laid out the items. Before we started positioning anything, we got things one in each grid cell. And that's not really what we want. But with some kinds of layouts, it's quite handy to be able to play with this item placement. I've got a list here, and it's basically an image gallery. So an ordered list, and inside there's some list items, and we've got some images in there. So I'm creating a grid. I've got 4 equal column tracks on the UL element. And that, without me doing anything else, would give me this. So the items are laid out, and you can see how taller items, the portrait images are quite tall, and then the landscape ones look a bit squashed because they're proportionally different. It'd be quite nice if those landscape ones spanned 2 tracks of the grid, which would kind of bring them more into proportion with the others. And we can do this. If I give the landscape images a class of landscape, I can just say grid column end span 2. So if grid comes across anything with a class of landscape, it should make the end line span 2. And that gives us this. So the auto placement algorithm lays out the items, and it moves along. It lays out item 1, item 2, well, that's got a class of landscapes. That needs to go over 2 tracks. And then item 3, that needs 2 tracks too. It can't fit in that gap, can it? OK, next line. And so we carry along. So we're keeping the elements here in source order. But if we add that property of grid auto flow with a value of dense, grid now backfills the gaps. So as it moves through the items and it leaves that gap, and then it places item 3 and it comes across item 4, and it's like, oh great, I've got a space for that. And it picks it up and it takes it out of source order and it puts it into the space, which is great for your image gallery, not so much for your form. I'll come back to that later. But first, I get this question asked to me an awful lot. Like almost every talk I do, someone will say, is Grid a competitor to Flexbox? As if the CSS working group are going around creating some sort of CSS specification deathmatch. Which one will win? Let's see. But no, these two things are very different. They've got some similarities and intentional similarities because it's much easier for us all to learn these things if they share common features. But they're for two kind of different tasks. So I'd like to talk about the similarities first. We've got this module called the Box Alignment Module Level 3. And where we've seen things stretching in Grid, going to the height of the content and so on, I've said that's a bit like Flexbox. And that's because both of these things are using box alignment. In fact, what box alignment is, it's all those neat features of Flexbox, all the alignment and space distribution and so on, taken out and put into a new module. By being in a new module, it means that other modules can then use them. So at the moment, that's Grid Layout, but it could be other things in future. So this is basically the vertical centering module. So if we've used Flexbox, so here this is a flex layout, so I'm saying display flex, and I've got some items. And if I was to create that same layout with Grid, I'd say display grid, and then I've got those items that are just laying themselves out on the grid. Now in both cases, the default alignment is stretch, so items stretch to the height of the tallest. So the first item there is a portrait image, and it's defining either the height of the grid area there of the grid row track, or it's defining the height of the flex container. So with Flexbox, I would center an item in that space with align self center, that's the second item there. Then we've got align self flex start for the third one, and align self flex end for the fourth one. Now if we look at Grid, it's pretty much the same, except we don't mention flex start and flex end. We've just got start and end. But they're going to behave in pretty much the same way. When you're working with Grid, you're aligning inside the grid area that you're dealing with. So that's an example of where those things they're pretty much the same. You could use either Grid or Flexbox to create that layout. So when should you use Grid instead of Flexbox? And now here's the key thing to remember. If you're laying things out as a column or as a row, then Flexbox is going to be fine. The row might wrap, but each new row is essentially a new flex container. So that's what we mean by one-dimensional. You're either a row or you're a column, you're not both at once. If you want to control both columns and rows, that's where you need Grid. And here's an example of that. So here I've got a set of items that are using Flexbox. My flex basis here is 200 pixels, and the items can grow and shrink. And that gives us this. So I've got too many items to fit into my row there at 200 pixels. So what happens is, as Flexbox lays out the items, it's like, oh, right, I've got too many items, we're allowed to wrap, it goes on to the next row, and then we've only got 2 items, so they're sharing the space, because that's how Flexbox works. Each of those rows is its own flex container, essentially. And so the space distribution happens row by row. And it would be the same if you're working by columns. If it wrapped onto a new column, which you'd set the height, the space distribution would work column by column. So when I teach Flexbox to people, and I show them something like this, the very next question is, what happens if I want to have card 4 and card 5 lining up under card 1 and card 2? And that is where you need Grid. That's where you need to control both rows and columns at the same time. So here we have Grid, and I'm using that autofill. So I'm saying, as many columns with a minimum of 200 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction unit, which gives us something like the flex layout. So I'm saying that, so I'm going to have the same kind of grid. I don't need to position the items, I don't need to add anything to the items, they'll just flow into it. An auto placement fills the content into cells of the grid, and it arranges them in rows and columns. So unless we specify a span of more than 1 track, things are just going to go into 1 track. So they're going to line up in their rows and their columns as well. So in practice, there are going to be lots of times where you could use one or the other, and it probably wouldn't matter, and it's just going to be up to you. You think, oh, well, I like this better, I'm going to use this here, or I'm using it for more things, so I'll carry on using it. But this is the big sort of difference, is do you want to control the layout in one dimension or two? Another way of thinking about it is that Flexbox kind of works from the content out. So you've got some stuff, maybe a list of navigation points, and you just want them spaced out evenly. That's a Flexbox thing, because the browser's looking at the content you've got, and it's spacing it out along that row. Grid works the other way around. So with grid, you say, this is my grid, content fit into it. So you're kind of working from the outside in, you're defining a grid. And this is why grid is going to perform much better than Flexbox does. I don't know if people might have spotted some of the things around Flexbox, people saying don't use it for full page layout, and that's because you get this content shifting effect. As a complicated layout loads in, Flexbox is looking at the content to work out what the spacing should be, and so you get this kind of jiggling as all the content shifts as it moves in. You don't get that with grid, because grid's saying, what have I got here? I need to create a grid that's going to fit this, and then you create the grid and then the stuff goes in, so you've already kind of got the grid before the items start to flow into it, so you avoid a lot of this content shifting that you'd get with Flexbox. So that's another way of looking at it, is that do you want to actually define an overall grid and place your items into it, or do you want to let the content decide? And I think there are different kinds of things in your UI that you're going to make those decisions around. So while I was thinking about this, I came across an example out there on the web that I thought we could probably do better with grid. This is the Envato Tuts Plus website, and they've got one of these sort of panels there on the homepage, which is used as navigation. There's a whole bunch of blocks in the panel. And the only way to do this with floated layouts really at the moment is to fix the height of things. And you might use JavaScript to kind of fudge that a bit if you need to, but you essentially have to fix the height of the blocks to get this kind of layout to work. And as you can see, if you add some more content, as I did using the browser console there, I added too much content into one of the boxes and it just overflowed. It's got nowhere to go because that box is fixed height. So you're either going to have to cut it off or just let it overflow if that happens. So absolute heights don't really work that well on the web. You can kind of fudge it for something like this, which is just got a little bit of content in. But the minute someone goes into your CMS and adds a whole bunch of content you didn't expect, the whole thing falls apart. So I wanted to see if I could make this better really with grid. And I can. So here's the layout I created, and I went for the different responsive breakpoints. So we've got a narrow layout, and then we've got this sort of two-column one, and then the wider one. So that mirrors what they've got on their site. And this is the thing to note. I've added a load of extra content to the box there about angry people at Bloom Fiestas. I've gone crazy with my news story and added far too much stuff. And so that box has expanded, and it's made room for the content. And it's made room by making the boxes to the side of it also taller because they're all in the same row on the grid. So they've also expanded and stretched down to allow space for that content. And that's something that's really very difficult to do at the moment. You'd probably have to invoke some JavaScript to get that to work and recalculate based on how much content had ended up there. And this works by using that min-max function again that you briefly saw before. So min-max lets us say, I'd like this to be a minimum size and a maximum size. So they could be two absolute values if you wanted. But what I'm doing here is I'm saying make it a minimum of 150 pixels tall. So I want my rows to always be 150 pixels, which mirrors what they were doing with their fixed heights. But if it all goes wrong and there is more than 150 pixels worth of content in here, then I want the maximum to be auto. And auto means essentially content sized in this basis. So it will just stretch and it will grow to take whatever content got put into the box. So we can have our fixed height look, and hopefully, if all the content editors know they're not to put too much stuff in there, that's what you'll get. But if it goes wrong, it's going to stretch and it's not going to fall apart. And then I chose to use Flexbox inside the areas because some of these, the captions and things needed pushing down to the bottom of the box. So I'm just using Flexbox and setting a margin top of auto just to get that effect inside my boxes. And again, I could have used grid, I could have created a grid in there, but Flexbox seemed to be ideal because it just deals with pushing the content around. Again, in the real world, this content's going to be added using a CMS, and not all CMSs are great at stopping people adding more content where they should not. So if you had the sort of thing where people could add boxes to this, and you had no way of restricting the number of boxes that got added, you know that one day you're going to look at the website and there's going to be some content that's just kind of appeared, and who knows where it's going to end up because it's not being positioned anywhere. Now, Grid copes with that really nicely for us. So this box down the bottom, that's just been added as another child element, so it's another box on the grid. And no, we've not got a background image for it because we hadn't sorted all that out, but things aren't broken. That looks okay. The content's not overlapping because Grid has just created an implicit track and it's taken that content and put it in there for us, and we can then sort it out. So I think this is how Grid is really reacting to the real world of content on the web. And that's really interesting to me because my day job, I'm a CMS vendor. I've got a content management system product. And so I see the real sort of problems of people using content and working with content editors. I see that every day. And it's that makes me so excited about this stuff. I think Grid is really reacting to the sort of stuff that we actually do these days, as opposed to coming from a past where people were laying out academic documents. So I'm really excited about Grid, as I'm sure you can see. But I think it raises some interesting questions around accessibility, as does Flexbox. Because we've got this ability to completely separate source and the design, which should be great. It should be a really good thing. But this ability for the kind of display and the source to end up very much out of sync could cause real problems, particularly for people who can see the display but are perhaps tabbing around the document, using the keyboard to navigate, for example. So ideally, this should allow us to create the most accessible source documents. So we should be able to create fantastic, really well-organized source documents, really good content that we can reuse all over the place, and then use Grid and Flexbox to create the best visual display for different devices, for different breakpoints. And considering how people who are using assistive technology and so on are going to be able to actually access the stuff. So it should be great, should be fantastic. It could be pretty bad, though, if people use Grid and Flexbox as an excuse to forget about the source. Well, it doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter, because, well, we can just move things around. It doesn't matter where it is in the document anymore. That would be pretty bad. What would be even worse would be if people started to strip out semantic elements to make everything a Grid or Flex item. And what I mean by that is things only become Grid items if they are a direct child of the Grid container. So I say display Grid, I create my 12-column grid. I can only position direct children on that grid. I can't sort of go right down into some form element that's deep down, nested right down there. Now, I think there's a real and present danger that possibly not individuals, because you'd know you were doing it and you should feel very bad if you are, but perhaps authoring tools. I mentioned Dreamweaver back at the start. I've worked with authoring tools before. Perhaps they might just decide to flatten out the source a bit to make it easier. Or JavaScript frameworks that could just, remove DOM elements, make everything flat, really easy then to position everything, isn't it? That would not be a good thing. So we don't want to be flattening out the source. And this sort of stuff worries me. The spec does warn against all sorts of accessibility issues. It warns against things like moving things out of source order. Source order is important for sequential navigation and non-CSS user agents. So it's warning us that grid placement affects the visual presentation. It doesn't change anything about your source. If logically you're reordering things to make a different sense of that document, you should be doing that in the source as well as in the display. There's a few examples out there from people who know far more about accessibility than I do. This is from Adrian Rosselli, some good example of how Grid and other layout methods work with tab order. There's currently a difference between how Chrome and Firefox work with tab order. It's actually a bug in Firefox that it is following the visual display, but some people are saying actually that's a better use case. So these things aren't solved problems yet. And if you're interested, and I hope everybody is interested, because I think this is something we need to care about, this is a really fantastic video from Leonie Watson. She talks about CSS accessibility, particularly around layout, and she explains how this all works with screen readers and so on. Really, really worth having a look. And also the article there, the keyboard navigation disconnect. That's a really useful article to understand a bit more about these issues. I think as a community, we need to be having discussions now about how we deal with this stuff and make sure that the accessibility is carried through as we all get excited about these sort of new methods and that we don't just create a big mess. So as for that flattening of markup issue, I'm really concerned about that because I can see that that is likely to happen, and there is in the spec something to mitigate this. It's perfectly valid for an item on the grid to have a grid declared upon it, just like with Flexbox. You know, you can have a flex item and you can say display flex on that flex item and then create, you know, sub-items as flex items. The same works exactly the same with grid. So here I've got an example of that. So here I've got a div with a class of wrapper, and inside I've got some boxes, so I've got some divs. As you can see, box D actually has 3 other divs nest inside it. So E, F, and G are children of box D. So I say display grid on my wrapper, and I create my grid, and I'm laying out A, B, C, and D on that grid. And so what I get is this. So those light boxes, they're inside D, and they're not laid out on the grid, and there's no auto placement taking effect on them because they're not direct children of that grid element, so they're just inside. So if I wanted to make those items a grid layout, I'd need to declare display grid on their parent, which is box D. So we declare a grid on D, and giving it a gap and so on. And I'm just going to create a 2-column grid here, and then I can position E, F, and G on that grid. So I've now got nested grids. So that's useful. We can nest grids one inside the other. You could also nest flex items inside a grid or whatever. You can go as far down as you want. But if you had this kind of multiple column grid system, what would be really neat would be if actually you could declare that on the parent, and then things down the tree could also use the same grid that was set up, not having to sort of create grids all the way down and manage those. That would be really neat. It would make creating sort of lined up layouts an awful lot more simple. And the level 1 spec actually includes a subgrid value for the display property. However, it's not been implemented in any browsers yet. And how this would work is in this layout, this is box D, just we had before, where we've created this grid, we've said display grid, and we've set up some columns. Instead of setting up the columns and rows if you wanted, you could say display subgrid, and that would be it, because the subgrid would then use the parent grid, sort of grid columns and rows. The problem with this not being implemented anywhere, even in an experimental way, is that it's marked as at risk in the specification. Now, what at risk means is that as the specification is kind of getting close to being made into a recommendation, to make something a recommendation, we need to have at least 2 implementations of each feature. So we need to have like 2 browsers in this case to have implemented subgrid. So we can say, yes, this feature works, and it works interoperably. It works across more than one browser. And this is a good thing, because what we don't want is one browser to do a whole load of stuff and that not end up in other browsers. So we want things that are recommendations to be implemented cross-browser. That's a good thing. I think we'd all agree with that. So in order to make that happen, and for the spec not to forever be stuck in limbo, things that are seen as possibly very difficult to implement are marked as at risk. And what that means is it could be dropped from the spec without needing to kind of take the spec through a whole big process again to make it a recommendation. So the status of subgrid is somewhat uncertain. And I think it's really important. We can see how it would be helpful in terms of our layouts, because we would like to be able to create grids and just use them even further down the tree. But I think the biggest issue is that then that leads to this accessibility issue. It leads to this issue of people flattening out their grids, flattening out their markup in order to use grid. I'm not the only person to be thinking in this way. Eric's written his own thoughts about the matter, and has also said that he hopes that they'll be implemented. I very much imagine at this point that Grid will be pushed into public release channels without subgrid. I would very much like other web developers to make a noise about this particular feature in order that it does get into implementation sooner rather than later and isn't forgotten about. And so on that note, what is the status of Grid Layout? So Jen showed you a browser support slide, and I'd like to just unpack where we are with Grid a little bit more for you. So last Thursday, the spec moved to candidate recommendation status, and that means that the working group feel that the spec is pretty much complete, and people should implement against it. So browsers should be able to implement, and they already are implementing, but they should be pretty safe to do that. And so what happens now is we need to make sure that those features all work, that there are interoperable implementations of the features, and there'll be a lot of testing going on. So if you go to Can I Use, you'll see something like this. They haven't updated to show that it's a candidate recommendation yet, and you'll notice something really weird and like this IE only thing. And Jen mentioned this yesterday, and how strange is that? Because we like to bash IE. They don't do anything good. They hold the web back, don't they? But this specification, it came from Internet Explorer. It was first implemented in IE 10. I wrote about it back then at the end of 2012. There's an article on 24 Ways that I wrote when I saw this, and I was really excited about it. So you can say thank you to Microsoft and the IE team that we have Grid at all. I very much doubt we'd be in the position we're in if they hadn't implemented, if they hadn't built something and said, look, this is pretty cool. And then there was a draft to work from, something that could be built upon. So yeah, that IE implementation is different. You can dig out that article of mine and read about it and see the differences. It's a lot more limited because it was the first attempt, it was the first draft. And so Edge have updated Grid to the new spec marked as high priority in their backlog, but I'd encourage you to go and vote and say that you definitely want that very, very soon. But I assume that they will ship at some point an updated version into Edge. And you can see all the little flags on the other browsers. So most things have got this flagged behind a browser flag. And a lot of that work, the work in Blink and also in WebKit, that's been done by an open source consultancy called Igalia, but not actually sort of people at Google themselves or whatever. It's actually been done by this open source consultancy, and interestingly, the work was funded by Bloomberg, which is an interesting story in itself, I think. An organization coming and funding a huge part of the CSS spec into a browser implementation. So they've been doing, for about the last 3 years, the Blink implementation, so that's Chrome and Opera, and it's also been going into WebKit, and so it's in Safari Technical Preview. So that's interesting. We've got this specification being built there. And Mozilla have got a really great implementation. They caught up very quickly with Blink. And at this point, what tends to happen is if you're using, say, Chrome Canary and Firefox Nightly, is you'll find that things sort of leapfrog each other. Sometimes one of them works, and then the next one will work, and then someone will implement a bit more. And so I'm kind of testing things as we go and seeing them work in one or the other. But all the time, this is the sort of meta bug there on Bugzilla for Mozilla. You're seeing things being fixed all the time. Work is really happening quite a pace on these. So to keep all this up to date, because it's a changing scene, this is a page on my site, Grid by Example. Browsers, I link to the browser meta bugs and let you know how you change the flags on your browsers to support Grid. And just any general browser-related information that comes my way, I stick onto that page. So that's a reasonable place to go. I'll try and keep that as up to date as possible. So this is really interesting. As Jen mentioned yesterday, this is all happening behind browser flags, and browsers are kind of working together, and you see on the mailing lists and in issues on GitHub, you see them talking and working together to get this specification out there into our hands. This is interop. This is what we asked for when I was part of the Web Standards Project. That we get these new specs and they're worked on together by all the browser manufacturers and other people in order to get something that really solves the problems that we have today. It's very, very cool. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, why are we spending all this time looking at something I cannot use yet? And here's why. Once specifications now are sort of out there and live, making changes to them are almost impossible because it will break production websites. And Jen spoke a bit about the mess that was left by, Flexbox coming out behind vendor prefixes, which we were never supposed to use on production websites. But we were all like, yay, new CSS, and it kind of works. And so we used it. And then it changed. And then we're like, bad browser vendors, you have a broken implementation. And it wasn't their fault. The spec changed. They implemented, thinking, yeah, this is the spec, we'll put it it's a vendor prefix, so people know they shouldn't be using it in production websites, and of course people use it in production websites, and then we end up with 3 lots of Flexbox out there. This is not a good thing, and so yeah, that's why new features are happening behind these experimental web platform features flags or specific feature flags in Mozilla. And so we have to take the initiative ourselves to toggle those flags and go and look at these things, because it's only while they're behind flags that we as web developers get a chance to make a difference to the specification. Once they get out there into the world, once they're out there in browsers, once they're used on production websites, that's it. It's very hard to make changes. You can add things, you can't change things. Behold the list of things that the CSS working group are going to change once we've invented a time machine. A lot of this stuff is really old. It goes back a long, long way. And a lot of those things that when you're developing, you're like, why do those people who make CSS, why have they done this? Why have they called this this? Why is this so weird? It's because of this. It's because things came from a time where we'd had no idea what we'd be using the web for. And so you get this chance by toggling flags, by going back and looking at things that are new that you can't use yet. You get this chance to take part, and you get this chance to make things better, and you get this chance to make things better for you in the future. So please do look at this stuff. Look at the new things that people talk about. Have a play around with examples. There's a fair few of us who love poking around at stuff that's hidden behind flags and create examples. So you can just go and look at those things and think, does it solve the problems that I have? Or do I see some big issue with this? Because actually, at the working group, people would love to hear that feedback. Because otherwise, you kind of get CSS that's developed by browser vendors as opposed to CSS that's developed by people who use CSS. And as someone who uses CSS, and as one of the few representatives on the CSS working group who is just a web developer, who isn't tied to a browser vendor, I'm very keen to have the voice of far more authors, as we call them, involved in the process to make sure that the CSS that we get is the CSS that we want. So please do have a look at these things while they're coming out, because once browsers ship, you lose that chance. CSS spec issues, they're all now on GitHub. We're all on GitHub. So you can go and you can have a look at the drafts, have a look at the things people are saying. A lot of it isn't just in perfectly normal language. It's people saying, oh, what should we call this feature? Or should we allow percentages in gaps? Or it's simple stuff, and you can come up with things. Yes, I've got a use case for that. I need this. So do have a look. It's really worthwhile doing. You're essentially doing a good deed for your future web developing self. So take a look at this stuff, because if you don't, you're really leaving your future in the hands of the very, very few of us who are doing this. So there's more code, lots and lots of code over at Grid by Example. This is actually the last time I'm going to be doing this talk in this form, and so what I'm doing is I'm taking a lot of these examples and ideas, I'm making a load of free video tutorials out of it. So you'll be able to go to Grid by Example. I've already put 7 of those up. There's lots of little short videos just explaining different things about the spec as well as example code. Please go have a look, fork my CodePen examples, have a play around, drop me a line on Twitter if you want to ask any questions. I love talking about this stuff. I'll be around for the rest of the day and tomorrow. And thank you very, very much for listening.